kettle and you can turn the heat up, and if you turn it up slowly enough because a frog is cold-blooded, it will literally boil to death even if it's able to jump out of the water. We melt. Our faith melts over time. And I've seen enough people of faith melt away to last a lifetime. And nothing would make me happier than to run into you guys 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, Lord willing, and discover that your faith life is stronger than ever. Which begs the question, what can I put into my life today to ensure that it will last? Are there practices or structures that I can put into my daily life today that will enable my faith to strengthen over time instead of melt? Is there anything I can do to avoid becoming another casualty of the faith? And I think that's the key question this morning. And that's where today's seventh and final step in the series comes in. Number 7 is the step of developing a rule of life. A rule of life. Now, if that phrase isn't familiar, don't be surprised. And don't let the word rule freak you out. The word rule comes from the Greek word for trellis. And those of you who are gardeners know that if you want to grow a vine, like a grapevine, you need a trellis to maximize that growth so that the grapevine can get off the ground and grow upwards and produce a lot of fruit. In the same way, a rule of life is a trellis that helps us keep close connection with God and enables us to produce maximum spiritual fruit for Him. So a rule of life is a plan. It's a conscientious, intentional plan that we develop to keep God at the center of our lives. And it's something that you create for yourself. No one else creates it for you. It's your responsibility, which the good part of that is you get to decide what you put in it, and you get to decide what you leave out. So your plan provides you with guidelines, a structure to help your connection with God stay strong. Now, can you see why a rule of life might be important when it comes to keeping your faith over the long term? Peter Scazzero, the author of Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, writes this: most Christians are not intentional, but rather functional, like cars on autopilot. Our crammed schedules, endless to-do lists, demanding jobs and families, constant noise, information bombardment, and anxieties keep us speeding up and not slowing down. We have routines to manage other parts of our lives. For example, each morning we may get up, feed the cat, make coffee, exercise, get dressed for work, and eat breakfast. But sadly, very few of us have a conscious plan for developing our spiritual life. And here's the reality that every believer in this theater this morning has to face. This world is not amenable to your Christian faith. This culture that we live in is not supportive of your Christian beliefs. Without a rule of life, your present spiritual practices are not enough to keep you afloat in the ocean of the beast, the Babylon of the 21st century. Fighting against such a strong current without the paddle of a rule of life, without the paddle of a plan or a structure, is almost impossible. And if that sounds alarmist, which I think it would, at least I'm in good company. In John chapter 15, Jesus is speaking to his followers, people he loves and cares about, and he says this: if you belonged to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world. But I have chosen you out of the world, and that's why the world hates you. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. And in the same talk, a little later, Jesus warns that in this world, if you're one of his followers, in this world, if you are a Christian, you will have trouble. There will be trouble related to your faith. The Apostle John writes something similar in 1 John chapter 2. Don't love the world's ways. Don't love the world's goods. Love of the world squeezes out love for God the Father. How's that for a picture? Practically everything that goes on in the world, wanting our own way, wanting everything for yourself, wanting to appear important, has nothing to do with the Father. It just isolates you from him. The world and all its wanting is on the way out, but whoever does what God wants is set free for eternity. The best way to ensure that your faith will stay strong tomorrow is to develop a plan today. Now, to plan well, we've got to go back. I would say we should go back all the way to Daniel. We met Daniel 2 weeks ago if you were here. And we need to go to church history to consider the roots of this hidden treasure of a rule of life. Around 600 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian armies invaded Jerusalem and overthrew the city. And most of the inhabitants over time were carried away into captivity. And a teenager named Daniel was one of these people who was captured. He was cut off from his family, from his teachers, from his friends, from his food, from his culture, from his religion, his language. And he was brought into the Babylonian court of the king and trained to serve in the court of the king. He went to the best university of the land. He studied a completely foreign and pagan way of viewing the world. Priests and counselors educated him in the wisdom of their religion. In Babylon's efforts to assimilate Daniel, they gave him a new name. His new name was Belteshazzar, after Bel, which was the chief Babylonian deity, Belteshazzar. So they tried to absorb Daniel into their culture. That was their one goal, is to eliminate Daniel's distinctiveness as a God follower and make him a Babylonian. But it didn't work. And I think the book of Daniel contains a great lesson for you and me. If Daniel could stand firm in his faith, if his faith could grow over time in such adverse conditions, then what excuse do we have today? I mean, he didn't have parents or adult mentors to encourage him and guide him and support him as this whole indoctrination process was being foisted upon him. He was literally kidnapped from his family and brought hundreds of kilometers away. He didn't have the luxury of just getting by, fading into the woodwork on the side of the culture. He was under constant scrutiny because he was being groomed to serve in the court of the king. They were choosing only the brightest and smartest young people, and he was considered one of them. And so he had to be prepared all the time, on his toes. But what Daniel did have was a plan. Daniel did have a rule of life. He didn't leave the spiritual development of his life to chance. He knew that going to church on Sundays and having a 10-minute quiet time every day wasn't going to cut it. And so his plan, we don't have a lot of specifics of it, but we discovered this. First of all, he renounced certain things. So his plan included not doing certain things that everybody else was doing. And chapter 1, for example, highlights the fact that he wouldn't eat the king's food, which was a courageous decision on his part, and it could have cost him his life. So he said, I'm going to renounce that. I'm going to follow kind of God's diet for my life. And then he also engaged in other things. We discovered 2 weeks ago in chapter 6 that he engaged in this daily office. Daniel took time 3 times a day to go into his room, to close his door, to get on his knees, and to have conversations with God, to spend time in prayer. So even in this extremely hostile environment, Daniel somehow fed himself spiritually and matured to become a person of significant influence in the Church of Jesus Christ. He knew that resisting the beast of Babylon required a plan that would enable him to pay attention to God. Now, Daniel's not the only one who had a rule of life. The very first Christians that we read about in Acts chapter 2, verse 42, we're told that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship. The Greek for fellowship is sharing, to the breaking of bread, or celebration of Lord's Supper, and to prayer.